Welcome students to lesson 15 of the natural hazards topic. In this lesson, our second of our case study on tropical storm Typhoon Haiyan, we're going to be looking at the effects of the storm on the Philippines. Last lesson, we found out where the Philippines were, what type of country it is, and why Typhoon Haiyan was so powerful. In this lesson, I'm going to tell you the story of Typhoon Haiyan through the eyes of a child who survived it. And through that story you will understand how devastating it was. Remember that every fact about Typhoon Haiyan is relevant to tropical storms that hit countries like the Philippines around the world. So that if in the exam you get a question about a different tropical storm, you can still think about Typhoon Haiyan and its effects to help you understand the effects of the storm that is referenced in the exam. Please write the date, title and learning objective and have a pen and paper ready to learn. Time to review prior learning. Write 1 to 10, answer the questions from memory and then mark your answers. Game time. Number 1. The Saffir-Simpson scale is used to measure tropical storms. 2. The minimum wind speed of a Category 5 tropical storm is 156 miles per hour. 3. The strongest winds of a tropical storm are located in the eye wall. 4. At 30 degrees north and south of the equator, air is sinking because air at high altitude is colder and denser. 5. The Coriolis Effect causes tropical storms to spin because the winds travel faster closer to the equator due to the Earth's rotation. Air rises when it heats up because as the atoms spread out, the air becomes less dense, like a sponge in water. 7. The Philippines is vulnerable to tropical storms because many of the settlements are on low-lying land near the sea. 8. A tiltmeter is used to measure the changing angle of a volcano's slope, which helps to predict eruptions. 9. Base isolation is used to separate a building from its foundations, which prevents earthquakes from damaging it. 10. By June 2010, the Chilean government had built 55,000 shelters for people after the earthquake. Give yourselves a mark out of 10. If you got 8 or more, excellent work. You've mastered these ideas. Any questions that you got wrong, test yourselves on them repeatedly until you have memorized them. To introduce the idea of Typhoon Haiyan's effects, I'm going to show you a photo of one of its effects and some questions. Use the photo and your own understanding to answer the questions, and then we will discuss them. This is Tacloban Airport, an important international airport in the Philippines. So number 1, describe what you see. Well, you should have said that the airport has clearly been destroyed. The roofs have been torn off, there's debris in the street here, cars have been overturned or buried. Aid workers seem to be coming, there are aeroplanes here with soldiers outside unloading goods. There's an aid tent here. Trees have been taken out. It's a scene of devastation. 2. Suggest why an airport is important after a natural disaster, such as Typhoon Haiyan. Airports allow international aid to arrive quickly. International aid typically arrives by plane because it's the fastest mode of transport, and so airports and their runways and the infrastructure, such as unloading goods using their trucks, are vital sources of aid infrastructure that allow help to be provided to people in need after a disaster. 3. What problems may have been caused because this happened? The destruction of an airport means that aid cannot be delivered to people. It also means that the aid agencies and organizations don't have a base to set up. In the longer term, it might mean conflict amongst the local people because there's a lack of aid. It might mean a slower economic recovery because there isn't enough work being done to restore buildings and jobs. It might mean higher death toll because fewer medics and doctors can reach people. 4. The airport is near the sea. Why might this make it vulnerable to tropical storms? Tropical storms have a number of major hazards associated with them. The 2 main ones are high winds and storm surges. Being located near the sea, especially on a low-lying area of land such as this, made the airport very vulnerable to Typhoon Haiyan's storm surge. In this lesson, I'm going to show you the story of Typhoon Haiyan's effect on the Philippines through the lens of Tacloban, one of the main towns in the Philippines with a population of more than 100,000 people. So, let's find out what happened. As I go through, write down key notes and draw it in a flow diagram form, so have arrows going between one sentence to the next so that you can see how one event leads to another, leads to another. This is the story of Typhoon Haiyan's effects. In this photo you can see Julian. He survived Typhoon Haiyan in 2013. But even today, when interviewed by journalists, he remains haunted by the memories. Thousands of his friends, family, and strangers were not as lucky as him. Here he is in school studying, preparing to create a great future for himself. But it all went wrong on November 8th, 2013, when Typhoon Haiyan hit the Philippine city of Tacloban. Julian was at school, much like you see in this photo. The typhoon brought incredibly strong winds up to 195 miles an hour that began uprooting trees and tearing off the roofs of houses. Almost all poorly constructed buildings in Tacloban, so about 90%, were destroyed in a matter of hours. That tells you that the resilience of the buildings in the Philippines was not good enough to be able to survive a Category 5 storm, because so many of the buildings were destroyed by the wind alone. The surprise to many, however, was the storm surge. A huge 5.2 meter high wave of water brought onto land by the extreme low pressure and winds of the storm devastated the towns. Roads were flooded and blocked, buildings washed away, and ships like this fishing trawler, the Ava Jocelyn, was brought onto land. Vehicles were crushed or shattered or swept out to sea. So transport after the storm had passed was even more difficult. Additionally, so many people rely on fishing for their jobs. That had a significant economic impact. After the storm had begun smashing into Julian's school, his father expected the storm surge to happen. He knew about storms in the Philippines because he'd survived one before. So he ran to Julian's school and managed to find him and took him to the Tacloban Convention Center, this building here. It's a meeting place where lots of music events and concerts happen in Tacloban. It was believed to be a strong and very large building that would keep people safe during the storm. Unfortunately, due to the building's location next to the coastline on low-lying land, and due to the unexpected height of the storm surge, the building was flooded, as you can see here, trapping people and causing panic. Julian's father, among others, tried to call his family, but the phone lines had been destroyed by the winds. They had to get out of the building. The city was getting violent as people struggled for food and water supplies, and so they began looting shops, stealing medicine and food and other items such as TVs, taking the opportunity they could. This is called looting. Rushing to the streets, Julian and his father realized the roads were blocked by strewn debris from the storm surge. Seeing other people going another route on foot and shouting about the airport, the pair went there in search of help. However, Tacloban International Airport had been a victim of the storm surge too. The main terminal, this building here where passengers load and unload their bags and where freight, so goods that are bought and traded, are unloaded, had been completely destroyed. The runway itself was completely blocked. This photo was actually taken a few days after, when the runway had begun to be cleared. There were no planes coming in or going out, so escape by plane or immediate arrivals of aid were impossible. Knowing this, they made their way back towards Tacloban's harbour in the small hope that the father's fishing boat had survived. It had not been spared. 95% of all fishing boats were destroyed by Haiyan's winds and waves. Suddenly, seeing a person making a call, Julian's father asked to borrow it to call his wife, a coconut farmer near Tacloban. She was despairing on the phone. She was very sad. All the trees had been destroyed by the winds and the storm surge. 10,000 families whose income depended on these coconut trees and the coconuts for their income were going to be directly affected by this storm. It was going to be an economic crisis where thousands of people were going to have lost their jobs and their income. And they were right. Some $13 billion of economic damage was done by this storm due to loss of jobs and damage to infrastructure, such as airports and ports and office buildings. Another reason these coconut farms and other farms were so badly damaged by the storm was called salinization. The salt water of the sea brought onto land by the storm surge killed crops because the salty water kills crops, preventing farming for many weeks and months afterwards, which extended the economic impact, slowing down the recovery. In their panic, so this is Julian and his father, and believing the school to have been evacuated, they had not even thought of Julian's older brother. They rushed to his school and found complete destruction. Some 3,701 schools like this one were ruined by the storm. This meant no education for children and a bleak future with no skills and little chance of a good job. It meant a lost generation where millions of people as old as Julian's brother and him would be unlikely to become wealthy. Days they waited after seeing this because they couldn't find Julian's brother. On the 13th of November, the town hall of Tacloban posted the names of the dead and missing. Their worst nightmare became real. Julian's brother was on the list. In just 3 short days, life in the Philippines was torn apart. 600,000 people, including Julian's family, were forced to leave and take shelter elsewhere. They were, like so many others, displaced from their homes. This meant a long road to recovery and a return to a normal life. And this is the experience of thousands of people in the Philippines after Typhoon Haiyan. In the links below this video, I attach a documentary on Typhoon Haiyan, which I strongly encourage you to watch and make notes on, as this adds extra details about the effects and responses to the storm. So for this C4L, to assess learning, I'd like you to read these 6 paragraphs and write economic, social, or environmental next to each number, 1 to 6. Okay, I'm going to show you the answers. Let's see if you understand this. If you haven't got them right, then I'd strongly suggest putting these on flashcards. So write a short sentence and put social, economic, or environmental on the back and test yourself until you remember them. Give yourselves a mark out of 6 for this. Remember that anything environmental is about pollution or the natural environment. So ecosystems, animal habitats, crops, this is environmental. Whereas social is about people and specifically their health, their education, and their happiness. Hunger affects health. Again, death is a social issue. Displacement, people being forced to leave. Pollution of rivers and lakes. And finally, a loss of income is economic. That's about jobs. Economic means about jobs and money. Remember, though, that all of these are linked. The loss of crops means a loss of income. Pollution means a loss of income. And so all these social and economic and environmental impacts are connected, and one often causes the other. Time to embed learning. I'm going to show you some questions. Answer them using your understanding and then mark your answers. So number 1, economic effects. Be specific and describe them clearly. Make sure you have 4 of these points, explained as I have. 2 environmental problems caused by the storm surge specifically. Make sure you have 2 of these points explained exactly as I have. 3. Again, make sure you have 2 of these points. You need the first one and 1 of the second or third. And finally, 4, which I'm not going to provide an answer for, but I just want you to consider, is which effect you think will have the longest impact on the Philippines, either economic or social. Give yourselves a mark out of 10. If you got 8 or more, awesome. Make sure you add in green pen any corrections or parts that you missed, any points that you may have missed here, for example. From the lesson, write 2 questions. I would strongly recommend you base them on some of the facts about the effects of Haiyan, or the reasons why the effects were so bad. Answer the questions from memory, and then in a week's time test yourselves on those questions so that you can increase your memory of Haiyan's events. Next lesson, we're going to be exploring how the Philippines and other countries around the world responded to Typhoon Haiyan, both immediately and in the long term. Join me then.